Thank you, Sergey, and welcome to the Jamstack Takeover. So my name is Gerald. I work on the support team at Netlify. Netlify is a static site host, and we provide a lot of services that a lot of people that run static sites needs. We do form processing, authentication. We integrate with Lambda. We have a CDN. We have a CI/CD, and a lot of other services. Check it out. I know a bunch of you are already using it. Sean also works at Netlify. So I'm not going to talk about Jamstack. Bud's going to talk about Jamstack after I'm done. I'm going to talk about authentication and JWT in particular. And I think this is increasingly a relevant topic as a lot of people create new microservices, and a lot of front-end developers are now writing their own Lambda functions and not just leaving all that to the back-end crew. And they now have to think about how they're going to authenticate their services, their websites, how they're going to handle all of this, and how to keep it performant. My talk concentrates on Jwt Based Authentication and why it's the better choice. To start, JWT or JOTs or JSON Web Tokens, it's an industry standard. It's a method for representing claims securely between two parties. What this means is that I can give you information and you'll believe me. So this is a JWT. It's separated into three parts. There's the head, the payload, and the signature. The head has information on what the JWT is. It'll say the type of encryption, et cetera. The payload is information that you want to send in the JWT. And the signature is how you authenticate. There are two main ways of signing a JWT. RS-256, which uses a private and a public key, and HS-256, which uses a single shared key. Different services use different ones. Some, like Auth0, support both. If you use Cognito, then it's just RS-256. If you use Firebase Auth, they also use RS-256. Just to be clear, none of this is encrypted, which means that you shouldn't send store secret information in your JWTs. The only thing that's encrypted is the signature. If you decode the JWT, the same one I just copied before, this is what's in it. It's just JSON. All of this is stuff that I put in it. Anyone can put whatever they want, whatever they need, and people typically put a lot of different information, though not too big, because again, these are going to be sent on all your requests. So here in the payload, where you store the information you want, like if you had a multi-tenant app, that you might add an audience and say what the name of it is or an ID for it. Here, EXP is the expiration, and that tells you when the JWT will expire. If you don't include expiration, then that means it'll never expire, and that's terrible for security. So here in app metadata is typically where you store the app information, and where you put user metadata is where you put the user information. You don't usually let users change any of this. You write into it securely, though you can have a section where you can store user information from the front end. This is the issued at date. And this is pretty simple. If you use Okta, if you use Cognito, Firebase Auth, et cetera, then their JWTs will have a lot more information. Here under authorization, you can find roles, and these will be specific to your website and what you need. If you have a CMS and you want someone that's supposed to have access to the CMS, then you can add CMS user. You can change it, do CMS admin, editor, et cetera, however you want to break down your roles. Or just user, if you just want to give them general user access to a protected page. In the head, again, is the algorithm. This one is signed with HS-256, which means there's a single shared key that you would use to decode and authenticate the signature. I made it super secret. Now, and most of the comparisons I'm doing here using JWT-based auth are against using standard session tokens and a single backend that has to authenticate on every single request. You don't have to do that with JWTs, and you also can store information in JWTs, unlike with traditional old school backends, where you have to authenticate every single request on your backend, and where you have to get user information again from your backend. The more active sessions, the bigger your database and server load, and you can't authenticate on the edge because, again, every request can only be authenticated on your backend. Big one also, I think, for a lot of new modern websites and services is the last point, which is with this old system, there's no way to authenticate third-party services without pinging your backend, which is a problem. Because if you want to set up a microservice to do something, it's much easier if you can have it authenticate without having to then set up a connection to your backend, which means that you're doing multiple authentication requests for every user session. So why is all that stuff important? Mostly it's not, except where it's important here. What you can do with JWTs that you can't do with the old school systems. You can gate content or URLs. You could do this with the old system. Roles, again, you could do this with the old system, but you have to authenticate in the backend and pull that information out of your database. Proxy and redirects. You could do this with JWTs. You can't do it performantly with the old system because you have to authenticate, again, with the backend. You could generate short-lived tokens for individual requests or to pass to third-party services. I'm going to show an example of this later because it's a little confusing if I just say that. But this is where a lot of the power in using JWTs or JWTs come from, and I'll show you that in a bit. So what makes these different? Claims can be authenticated without having to verify every request from the back end, and you can store user information directly in the JWT. That's essentially it. Every single benefit comes from this, and this means you're going to have lower latency. You're going to have fewer points of failure on your website and your services, and for self-hosted backends, you can manage more users and logged-in sessions using less resources, and you can scale much easier using JWTs. All of this means better performance for your web apps. For those of you that are using JWTs now, a lot of you probably aren't, don't even realize it. Like again, if you use Firebase, Okta, or any of this stuff, then you probably aren't using it as much as you can and maybe as much as you should. If you're not authenticating your serverless functions, you can do that, and it's essentially free because decoding a JWT in any function in almost any language is cheap and fast. And if you can run your functions for less time, you'll incur less bills because you get charged for runtime on your functions. You can authenticate them in your reverse proxies. Nginx is an example, but you could do it in Caddy and several others. Again, if you're using a reverse proxy to either load balance or protect your various networks, all that stuff, you can authenticate right there and prevent any requests that don't have a JWT or have an expired one from hitting your actual node API or anything directly. You can use that same token to authenticate in your CMS if you're using one. You could write all these codes, the microservices, all of these things without having to worry about how it affects your backend or how it'll scale because you can use that same token, encode the roles, encode the user access, encode user information, which you can read in your front end or back end or function. So you can even pull the user information who's writing a new CMS post directly from the JWT. So at Netlify, we use them pretty heavily. We do provide an identity service, but this is some examples of how we use them internally. If you're using redirects, either proxy redirects or if you're redirecting with like a 301, you can sign your redirects with a JWT. And we will generate a JWT and put it in a header in the redirect. So if you're proxying one of your own servers, your API or anything like that, you can know that that request came from Netlify. We pass them into Lambda functions. If you use our identity service for managing users, we integrate with Lambda, and in the Lambda context, we pass in JWTs that are short-lived. They're only good for about a minute. But inside that function, you can use that JWT to make admin commands directly on your Lambda instance. I'm sorry, directly on your identity instance. And we do sign notifications. We have a CI/CD system. So you push to GitHub, and we see that we build your site. If your deploy succeeds, fails, whatever it is, we can sign the notifications so you know that they're coming from us. So these are some authentication providers that use JWTs. Amazon Cognito, Auth0, Firebase, Okta, Netlify Identity, and self-hosted. There are so many open source packages for generating. You can integrate it directly into your existing authentication flow. Node packages, Ruby, Go. We created an open source one called GoTrue. There are a lot, and you can use them everywhere. So I made a quick little app, and I'm going to show you guys. So I made this just to show some of the power of JWTs and what you can do with them. All right, so this is a very simple site, and it lets you do a couple things. If you click Get JWT, it'll just hit a Lambda function I wrote that will generate a JWT with a 1-hour expiration, and it'll return it to your front end, and we'll save it inside of a cookie. If you get JWT with invalid signature, it'll create it, but it'll use a different secret to sign it. And here, this just clears a JWT and removes the cookie. And this is another function that verifies that it's a valid JWT. At the top, signed redirects is just an example. I'm going to show you how you can do proxy redirects with JWTs to verify the origin. And over there, Cloudflare Worker, Netlify Authentication, Fastly, awesome sponsors, also let you do this. But you have to use VCL, which I don't actually know, so I wrote it for Cloudflare. So that's the JWT that was just generated for me in a Lambda function. I cleared it, mainly so I can show you this. If I try and go, sorry, everything's blown up, to Cloudflare Worker, it won't work because I'm not authenticated. Same thing if I do Netlify Auth, not authenticated. If I go back home, and now I have this JWT, which has a user role that I'm checking for, and now the page loads. Same thing here. So that's the same JWT that's being authenticated on the edge at Netlify and RCDN and on Cloudflare using their workers. This was very simple code that I can show you that I used to do that. Again, I'm also doing a secure proxying here. Say if you had a separate website, you wanted to make sure that users were both coming from Netlify and had valid JWTs. This is using a Netlify redirects, but you can do this using anything. It connects to this request bin. And the request comes here. And you can see we added a JWT. And you can check that JWT with any library. And you can see the deploy context, when it expires, which is only 5 minutes, the ID and the site URL. So now you know exactly where this request comes from. You can use this on the site that you're proxying. You could use this in your API. You can use this in your Lambda functions. You can use it anywhere. And that is my little talk on JWTs.